We have next The History of Voter Fraud by Hans von Spakowsky. Did I say it right that time? See, it's easier reading it than it is trying to do it from memory. The Manager of Election Law, this is Manager Election Law Reform Initiative and Senior Legal Fellow, the Meese Center for Legal and Justice Studies at the Heritage Foundation. That's a lot. And he's got this new book out that I have here. We were hoping he was going to bring some more so you could sign them, but this is the only one he brought, so you'll have to fight over it. Called, I guess I can just read it, Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. Now I have this, and I am reading it, and I told him I don't have a hard copy. What I have is a digital copy, because I'm, carrying books around like this, your arms get tired. So I have it in my tablet, and I have the audio. So I've bought it twice, and I'm about halfway through it. It's an excellent read, and I'm so proud to have him here. I want to thank Heritage for letting him come out and for him to come out and share with us about election fraud.
All right, well, Reverend Wallace gave me a tough job following people like Mrs. Wallace and General Hill. But I'm going to try to do that. Before I do that, one quick business thing, and that is, the Heritage Foundation is one of the largest think tanks in the world. It's really a leading think tank. And if you have kids or grandkids who are in college, I want to be sure you all know that we have probably, I think, the best internship program in Washington. So if you want kids to get a good experience, get them to apply. You have to be a rising junior in college. We also take people who've graduated. And it's got 3 big advantages over other internship programs. First of all, our interns do real work. There's a lot of folks go intern for a member of Congress and they get coffee and make photocopies. Our interns don't do that. They do real work. I have an intern working for me, doing all kinds of research, helping me write pieces. The second big thing is, look, we're a conservative think tank. We pay our interns. We don't believe in free work, which is also another problem. And third, and this is very important because, as you know, metropolitan Washington is a very expensive place to live. We provide housing for our interns. So I urge you, if you know kids who are interested in this, please apply. I want to make 3 points today, and I'm going to have to talk fast, overcome my Southern heritage and talk fast because I only have 30 minutes. First of all, look, election fraud does exist in the United States. Unfortunately, it occurs. The media says, don't worry about it. They used to say, it doesn't exist. Now they reluctantly agree to it a lot because of the Heritage Election Fraud Database, which I'm going to tell you about later. The other big thing they always are constantly saying is, well, there's no massive voter fraud in the United States. Well, I've never said there's massive voter fraud, but there's enough of it that we ought to be concerned about it. And I always ask them, well, how much voter fraud do you think is acceptable? And they never have an answer to that. Their other big thing is they'll say, well, 130, 140 million people voted in the last presidential election. Well, that's true. But as former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell can tell you, we have small and local and state elections all the time in this country. City council, county commissioner, state legislative seats, those races are always and many times decided by a handful of votes. I was just in Ohio speaking, and the Secretary of State there had just put out a press release over the fact that they had local elections in November, and 18 local races were decided in 18 different counties by a tie vote. I think they had to flip a coin to see who would be the winner, and that really shows that problem. The second thing is our election process can be improved. There are all kinds of fixes that can be put in that will provide both what General Hill talked about, which is both access and security. The progressive left talks as if one counteracts the other. It doesn't. You can provide both access, making sure everybody who's eligible is able to vote, at the same time that you provide security, because just as important as making sure everybody who's eligible to vote is making sure that their vote isn't nullified by fraud or mistakes or errors made by election officials. And third, this claim that there's a wave of voter suppression going on across the country by doing common sense things like requiring an eye to vote, that is a completely bogus claim intended to scare off reformers and to raise money for the groups making it. How many of y'all have been to Washington, D.C. and been to Mount Vernon for a tour? Anybody? Okay. Well, I don't know if you've been there recently, but there's a few years ago they built something new there. The ladies who run Mount Vernon were doing research in the archives, and you know what they discovered? George Washington's whiskey recipe. So they entered into a contract with Jim Beam. They built a small distillery on the site where George Washington had his distillery, and they make whiskey according to his formula. Very expensive, but they make whiskey according to his formula. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because when George Washington ran for the House of Burgess in Washington the first time, he complied with the custom of that time of making and feeding whiskey to voters to entice them to vote for him. James Madison, who thought this was disgusting, refused to do it, and he lost his first race. Okay? Now, people say, well, that's ancient history, but we have cases in our database of not too long ago of voters being paid. We have one case, I think it was in Texas, where they're being paid with cigarettes, cocaine, and cash. So that has not gone away. There is a big push in the 2020 election. It's continuing to get as many people to vote through the mail by absentee ballots, which a report from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, this was released about 10 years ago, and it was a report on a series of absentee voter fraud cases that have been prosecuted in Florida, and the law enforcement agency called absentee ballots the tool of choice of vote thieves. And the reason for that is there's no chain of custody. They're the only ballots voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And remember, transparency is very important to elections. And there's no one to protect voters in their homes or elsewhere from being pressured, coerced, and intimidated to vote a particular way. And most people don't know this, but the first time absentee ballots were used in American elections was in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln was in a very tough, close re-election campaign. You may recall that his opponent was former Union General George McClellan, who wanted to end the war with an armistice, quit fighting, which would have left slavery in place in the United States. The governor of New York supported McClellan, and they came up with absentee ballots. Why? Well, because all these Union troops were in the field. They couldn't go back home to vote. So they came up with the idea of absentee ballots, and the New York governor organized a campaign to steal their votes, which included forging the signatures of the soldiers, particularly a lot of wounded soldiers who were in Union hospitals. I tell people that, and they say, you're just making that up. No, actually, in 2020, the Washington Post, you know, that liberal rag we have, ran a big story about this, about all the findings in that absentee ballot fraud case. Now, we are in Chicago, so I do have to mention that the largest voter fraud case ever prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice was in Chicago, 1982. And for those of you who may recall this, Big Jim Thompson was the Republican governor. He was in an election against Adlai Stevenson III. Going into the race, Thompson was ahead. The polling showed by 15 points. On election day, Stevenson came within 5,000 votes of winning the election. Now, nobody would have thought twice about it, except that one day the FBI field office in Chicago, which is one of the largest field offices in the country, got a phone call. The phone call was from a guy who'd worked in a Chicago precinct, and before the election, he was told he would get a city job if he helped stuff the ballot box on election day with fraudulent votes. He did that, and then after election day, the precinct chair called him up and said, "Sorry, you're not getting that job." Another good lesson, and you really should keep your campaign promises. The point is that started the unraveling and revealing of what happened in that case. After a while, the entire FBI field office was involved in a massive investigation. The U.S. attorney convened a grand jury. The grand jury eventually published its report. As General Hill could tell you, that's very unusual. Grand jury proceedings are secret. They thought what they had found was so important that they revealed their findings. Every kind of fraud you could possibly imagine had occurred in Chicago. Everything from paying voters to absentee ballot fraud to people who were in the state penitentiary somehow casting votes. I mean, it was just one thing after another. Also, folks working in the precinct simply stuffing fraudulent ballots into the ballot box. They prosecuted over and convicted over 60 individuals. I wrote a case study on this. I interviewed the head FBI agent, I interviewed the U.S. attorney, and they basically told me that they estimated fraud had occurred in every single precinct in Chicago, and they just ran out of resources. They couldn't prosecute everybody. But, you know, often you hear folks on the left say, well, these kind of prosecutions are intended to suppress votes, right? Well, let me tell you what happened because of that case. The U.S. attorney said, well, look, we have an upcoming election, and I want my lawyers, I want the FBI agents, I want all of you to volunteer to be poll watchers. And they did that. And you know what happened in that election? First African American was elected the mayor of Chicago in its entire history, Harold Washington. And a lot of people say the reason for that was because of the presence of these assistant U.S. attorneys and FBI agents, and people were scared to conduct the same kind of fraud. And remember, this fraud in the '82 election occurred 6 years after Mayor Daley was dead, and his machine was still working. Again, people say to me, oh, that's old news. So I say, okay, let's go to 1997. Miami-Dade County mayor's race overturned by a local court who estimated that 5,000 fraudulent ballots had been cast in that election, and the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation, in-depth investigation of that fraud, something that, as you know, no newspaper today will do, because they are on the side of the left and saying there's no fraud. I hate to pick on Indiana, but let's go forward to 2004, when the Indiana State Supreme Court issued a decision confirming the overturning of an election and this is just so ironic, of massive absentee ballot fraud in a Democratic mayoral race in East Chicago, Indiana. So they obviously were copying the tactics of Chicago. Now, the importance of that case is this, because this is a common feature you find in all too many of these cases. The court talked about the fact that there was a predatory pattern in how this campaign picked on the people whose votes they were stealing. Who did they target? First-time voters, or those otherwise less informed voters who were lacking in knowledge of the voting process, the infirm, the poor, and those with limited skills in the English language. The targets of this kind of fraud often are people in poor minority neighborhoods, people who are immigrants, and others who don't understand what is being done to them. And that, remember, this was fraud in a Democratic primary. You know, some people think that when fraud occurs, it's one party stealing from another. No, many of the cases you'll find in our database are people in the same party stealing from other people in the same party. Again, people say, oh, that's old, that was 2004. Last year, 2 city council races were overturned in Mississippi and Florida because of fraud. And just a few weeks ago, how many of you guys have seen the movie Straight Outta Compton? Okay, in Compton, just a couple of weeks ago, 3 individuals pleaded no contest to committing voter registration and absentee ballot fraud in a city council race a year ago. There are 3 more people who've been indicted and still waiting to go to trial, including a candidate who won that city council race. What were they doing? Well, they were engaging in absentee ballot fraud, and they were engaging in voter registration fraud. These 3 individuals who said, okay, I'm not going to contest this, registered to vote in Compton, even though they don't live in Compton, including at the house of one of the candidates. The city council member who won that city council election and who's been indicted, but who's fighting it, you know what the margin of victory was in his race? 1 vote. So it's pretty clear the fraud probably made the difference. And here, just one final quick example that tells you, again, the individuals who are targeted by this. Just a couple of weeks ago, a nursing home supervisor in Macomb County, Michigan, was found guilty of forging the signatures of senior citizens in her home on absentee ballot request forms. She did this for about 24 of the senior citizens in her home. Now, obviously you know what would have happened if they hadn't caught it and those absentee ballots had been sent there. She would have filled them out, forged the signatures again, and voted 24 times. Our database that we started a couple years ago at the Heritage Foundation we're up to 1,349 cases of proven fraud from around the country. Now, we knew that our database would be put under a microscope by the Brennan Center, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which actually did happen. So we only put in proven cases. Somebody's convicted in a court of law or a judge ordered a new election. Now, the left often looks at this and says, oh, by the way, before I left, I approved 4 new cases to get put in. Recent cases. Now, the left looks at that and says, oh, see, this is such a small problem, you shouldn't worry about it. Oh, by the way, Illinois has we have like 44 recent cases. Remember, this is just a sampling. This is not a complete comprehensive survey. I don't have the resources to do that. Plus, a lot of cases aren't reported. The left often says, oh, well, see, this isn't much. You don't need to worry about it. But I want to give you 2 examples of why this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? I work at the Heritage Foundation, but I'm on the board of this great nonprofit group called the Public Interest Legal Foundation. Secretary Blackwell is also on the board. It's one of the only organizations out there that actually is devoted to election integrity. In 2020, they spent a lot of money to get hold of the statewide voter registration lists from 42 states. The other states, they had problems getting it. Anyway, 42 states, right? And they got the voter histories too. Now, voter registration lists in this country, particularly in places like Illinois, are in horrible condition. You know, they're incomplete, they're full of errors, and so in order to correct that problem, what the Public Interest Legal Foundation did is they did what, frankly, election officials ought to be doing, which is they supplemented these statewide official records with commercial data, particularly from credit agencies. Okay, I'm sure you all know, you'd be scared at how much credit agencies know about each of you. But because we supplemented the data, what were we able to get? Unique identifiers on each registered voter, like their full Social Security number. Now, why is this important? Because if you want to compare Indiana to Illinois and find out whether the Ken Blackwell who's registered to vote in Ohio is the same or a different Ken Blackwell that's registered in Illinois. The only way you can do that is if you have a unique identifier like Social Security number. They then compared the data. That what they had was, remember this is 2020, so they had the 2016 and 2018 elections. So what did they find? Over 144,000 cases of potential fraud. That included 15,000 deceased individuals who the state election officials said had voted. 8,400 people who voted in 2 different states in the 2018 election because they're registered in 2 different states. 81,000 people who voted twice because they're registered twice at the same address in the same state with slight discrepancies in their names. So election officials didn't realize it's 2 different people. 5,500 people who voted twice in the same state because they're registered at 2 different addresses in the same state, and over 34,000 people who in 2018 voted despite the fact that they were registered to vote. Remember, the law says you got to be registered where you live. These people were registered at everything from gas stations, vacant lots, to restaurants, basketball courts, etc. Now, here's the important point about this. Remember, our database is about, we're getting up to 1,400 cases. Here's 144,000 potential cases of fraud. PILF publicizes a big report about it, puts out a press release, writes about it. Do you know that not a single election official and not a single law enforcement official and no one in the U.S. Department of Justice, no one contacted the Public Interest Legal Foundation and said, well, send us the data, the files on the people in our state who you say voted twice so we can investigate and potentially prosecute. No one. And the other big problem here is even when election officials send this information over to particularly local DAs, they often have no interest in prosecuting these cases. Some of it is political, other times it's because they say, well, I've got murder cases and rapes and assaults, and this just isn't important. So it's a matter of priorities. Do you want to know how bad that problem is? Here's an example. Again, the Public Interest Legal Foundation. Florida has extremely good state open records laws. So after the 2020 election, Public Interest Legal Foundation sent a FOIA request to the 10 biggest counties in Florida and said, we want your files on every criminal referral that your county election officials sent to the local DA. Now, again, as I can tell you as a former county election official in 2 different states, election officials, they're not going to send a file to the local DA unless they have substantial evidence that fraud occurred, because they don't want to get sued for defamation or libel and have all these problems because they've sent something over that's not really fraud. 9 of the 10 counties got back to PILF and said, our election officials made 156 referrals for fraud connected to the 2020 election. We then went to state court records and checked the files. We went to the local DA's offices and checked with them. Anybody care to guess how many of those cases were actually investigated by the local DAs in those 9 counties? 0. Not a single one. And one of the counties, Hillsborough County, sent back a letter saying, oh, well, we don't ever make criminal referrals to the local DA. So even when they find fraud has occurred, they do nothing about it. So what are the solutions to this? Well, the solutions are improving the laws in each state. Now, if you want to know how to do this, let me tell you very quickly. In January, more than a year ago, so after the 2020 election, I was in a meeting and somebody actually at Heritage said to me, well, look, what are the best states in the country and what are the worst when it comes to election integrity? And off the top of my head, because I've been in this game a long time, in fact, Ken, you and I have known each other for, 2 decades. I said, well, these states are good. I know these states are bad. But we realized there's no objective measure out there. So here's what we did. We put out a 7-page heritage fact sheet on what we consider to be the best practices for fair and honest elections. It's a bullet point list. And it just goes through and says, here's how states ought to handle the cleanup and maintenance of the accuracy of voter lists. Here's how they should handle absentee ballots. It goes through its 12 broad categories, 47 different criteria. And then we undertook this massive project of analyzing the laws of all 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, because they can vote in the presidential election, to see, do they match our recommendations? A perfect score was 100. No state in the country got 100. We released this in December, so it included all the election reforms that were made last year. No state got 100. I think the highest score by a state was 83. And this is a placard that I've got a whole bunch of them, which you can take with you. It's got a reference to the website. The point of this is you can look up any state. It'll give you its ranking, its score, but also it gives you a complete summary of the laws and what the status of those is in those states. I hate to tell you this, but unfortunately, Illinois' ranking is 39th in the country with a score of only 49, which is a flunking grade according to the report cards my kids used to bring home. But the point of this is it gives you at the grassroots and state legislators the ability to figure out what do we need to do to fix this. So I'd urge you to use it. Okay, now the voter suppression myth. I still have a few minutes, right? Okay, just very quickly. Look, here's the key thing you need to understand about this. We've got 14, the left hates actual facts. It's 2022. We've got more than 14 years worth of turnout data to judge voter ID laws with. In Indiana, the voter ID law was in place for the first time presidential election, 2008. In Georgia, their photo ID law was in place for the first time in 2008. So we have turnout data for these states and every other state that's put in an ID requirement. 2 years ago, the National Bureau of Economic Research put out a study. You know what they did? They pulled the turnout data from all 50 states from 2008 through the 2018 election. And what did they do? They compared states with an ID requirement to states without one, like New York and California. You know what their conclusion was about voter ID laws? Quote, they have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. In other words, they don't depress turnout. In Georgia in 2008, when their ID law was in place for the first time, they had the largest turnout in their history, and they have had record registration and turnout since then. In fact, the increase in Democratic turnout in Georgia in the general election in 2008 with their new ID law over 2004 when there was no ID law, it was the 5th biggest increase in the country. Their overall turnout in the general election was up 7 percentage points over the prior presidential election. That was the 2nd biggest increase in the entire country. Now, Georgia, being one of the states that was covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, actually keeps its turnout data by race. So remember, the ACLU and others had filed a lawsuit against the Georgia law saying this was discriminatory. It would keep African-American voters from being able to vote. You know, Georgia's African-American population is about 30%. The lawsuit lost, by the way, after 2 years, and the judge put into his order that after 2 years of litigation, the plaintiffs have been unable to find a single person in the state be unable to vote because of the ID requirement. Here's what happened to turnout
And I hate to give you all these numbers, but this is really important. Here's what happened to turnout in Georgia in 2008 when their ID law was in place for the first time. Black turnout was up 140% over the prior election. Hispanic turnout was up 42%, and white turnout was up 8%. In 2010, which was a congressional race, right? No presidential election, black turnout was up 66.5%, Hispanic turnout was up 44%, and white turnout was up almost 12%. So turnout went up. It didn't go down. Indiana, in 2008, with their ID law in place for the first time, you know who won the state of Indiana in 2008 in the general election? Barack Obama. He was the first Democrat to win the state in, since the early 1960s. Not only that, but the increase in turnout of Democrats in Indiana was the biggest increase of any state in the entire United States with a new ID law in place. I got to tell two stories, which I know you know, about the Indiana ID law, okay? The first is that Indiana got sued by twice the usual number of suspects, you know, the ACLU, League of Women, all these people, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issued decisions saying, look, requiring an ID is a tangential, minimal burden on voters. And the U.S. has a long history of voter fraud. It's been documented by journalists and historians, and it is perfectly constitutional to ask for an ID. Now, a lot of people, when they hear that on the progressive side, say, oh, well, I'm sure it was just those horrible conservatives on the court who issued that decision. No, it was a 6-3 decision, and the decision was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the liberal stalwarts of the court. The ACLU was arguing to them that there's no election fraud, it just doesn't happen in the U.S., there's no need for this. They seem to have forgotten that Justice Stevens, where did he spend his professional career before he became a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court? In Chicago. So arguing that there's no fraud just didn't work with him. The second story I got to tell about that case, which I just find very amusing, was that the ACLU, there was an amicus brief filed by the ACLU saying, this is a horrible law, there's no reason for it, and all these people had trouble voting because of this law. And they specifically named a woman who they said had trouble voting in Indiana because of the ID law. So a local newspaper, is it Indianapolis Star maybe? Indianapolis Star decided, oh, well, this is an Indiana case, let's go interview this lady and find out what her problem was on election day. So they went and interviewed her. And you know why she had a problem voting on election day? Because when they asked her for an ID, she pulled out a Florida driver's license. So it turned out that she and her husband had a home in Florida, also in Indiana. And you know what she had done in Florida on her home? She and her husband had gotten a reduction of their property taxes because she had filed for a homestead exemption. When you file for a homestead exemption, you're declaring that's where you live. So the law actually worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Now, finally, because I don't want to go over time, we really heard a lot about voter suppression recently. That has been the theme of the left. You know, Joe Biden and others talked about Jim Crow 2.0. Well, the U.S. Census Bureau issued a report after every election on turnout. And in Mississippi, remember, look, the Voting Rights Act was probably one of the most effective laws ever passed by the U.S. Congress. It was needed. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, the turnout and registration, for example, of African Americans, places like Mississippi was in the teens. It was a needed law. But I would say it's one of the most effective laws ever passed in the history of the United States. According to the Census Bureau, in the 2016, 2018, and 2020 federal elections, so the last three federal elections, the turnout of voters in Mississippi was higher than the turnout in Connecticut, New York, and the president's home state of Delaware. Not only that, but the turnout of African American voters in Mississippi in those 3 elections was higher than the turnout of white voters in Mississippi. Georgia, in the last 3 federal elections, according to the Census Bureau, had higher turnout than the city of New York. And remember, the state of New York. Remember, New York has no ID. Georgia does, yet turnout was higher than. And the turnout of African American voters in Georgia with an ID law in the last 2 federal elections was higher than the turnout of African Americans in New York. In fact, the turnout in the 2020 election was the highest turnout we've had since the 1992 presidential election, when all this supposed voter suppression is going on. And registration was higher in 2020 than in the last 5 presidential elections. The attitude of the progressive left on this and opponents of election reform it's I don't know how to say it other than it's patronizingly racist. And one of the best things I've heard said about this was by Mark Robinson. Mark Robinson is the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina. First African American ever elected as the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina. And last year, he testified in front of a committee in the United States House of Representatives when they were looking at these really bad election bills that they wanted to pass. Can I read you just a quick quote from him? This is really worth it. His testimony is devastating, worth reading. But today we hear Georgia law being compared to Jim Crow, that black voices are being silenced, and that black voices are being kept out. How? By bullets? By bombs? By nooses? No, by requiring a free ID to secure a vote. Let me say that again, by requiring a free ID to secure the vote. How absolutely preposterous. Are you kidding me? The notion that people must be protected from a free ID to secure their votes is not just insane, it is insulting. I'll end with one more quote. In 2000, what's so weird about this today is the quest for election integrity used to be a bipartisan thing. It's really only in the last 10, 15 years that it has become a partisan issue. And this is best shown by a report issued in 2005, the Commission on Federal Election Reform. It was chaired by former Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Republican Secretary of State James Baker. And they made all kinds of recommendations that I agree with, that I think are great. And at the end of the report, they said this: elections are the heart of democracy. They are the instrument for the people to choose leaders and to hold them accountable. At the same time, elections are a core public function upon which all other government responsibilities depend. If elections are defective, the entire democratic system is at risk. Thanks.